July 1, 1928, Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale sits in a speakeasy enjoying a drink. The 35-year-old gangster had come a long way in the underworld. He may have started out as a simple punk, but now he's Brooklyn's #1 mobster. Considered by many to be a Robin Hood of sorts, instead of robbing from the rich to give to the poor, he killed people, muscled his way into legitimate businesses, took over unions and committed various other crimes before giving to the poor. But why split hairs? After all, it was said that a fellow countryman down on his luck could approach him in his usual seat at the Citadel coffee shop and not walk away disappointed. If a business was robbed in his bailiwick, he could get the stuff back. Didn't he also provide a train car full of coal for the needy during a winter coal strike? He had legitimate businesses as well. On the books he was an undertaker, running a funeral parlor with his brother Angelo. There was a taxi business and a cigar company. All the tobacco shops within his sphere of influence carried his brand, named after him of course. Rumor has it that he forced the cigars on the shops just as a bootlegger forced his booze on a tavern. It was also said that the cigars were of poor quality and the term Frankie Yale became synonymous with a bad stogie. As Yale enjoys his drink, the phone rings. It's for him. It's believed that the person on the other end is his underboss Anthony Carfano, aka Little Audie Pisano. Other reports have it that it is his new wife calling him from their apartment in Manhattan. Hanging up the phone, he leaves. Moments later he is driving through the streets of Brooklyn in his Lincoln. He doesn't get far before a sedan pulls up behind him. No doubt his gangster instincts tell him something is amiss. Any doubts are removed when his rear window is blown out. Yep, the Beau Brummel of Brooklyn is on the spot again. He's been here before, and he survived. Perhaps he'll make it again. He guns it. Yale's journey to this moment began some 20 years earlier when, we are told, he began his association with underworld figure John Torrio. Like most hoodlums, he worked his way up from minor infractions. His first arrest came in 1912 for disorderly conduct. Again in 1913 for the same offense. He was apprehended in 1915 along with 3 others for robbery and assault after beating up a bartender and stealing $2. Though initially found guilty, he was exonerated a few months later when a couple of other guys admitted to the crime. There was nobody to come forward and save him 2 years later when he was arrested for possessing a gun. He was sent to the penitentiary for a year. The dawn of Prohibition found Yale involved in a Coney Island cabaret called the Harvard Inn. The club had been raided by federal agents in early 1920 and the manager stepped aside. It is around this time that Yale became identified as either the proprietor or the manager of the club. Some reports have Mafia boss Vincent Terranova of Harlem's infamous Morello Terranova clan as the true owner. It is at the Harvard Inn, we are told, that a young Al Capone went to work for Yale. Though Capone biographers describe the Harvard Inn as a dive, contemporary accounts tell a different story. Located on Coney Island, it appears to have been a popular summertime resort. The weekly entertainment magazines Variety and The Billboard often had blurbs about the acts performing there. On a few occasions they mentioned Yale himself. The club even had its own baseball team. There was some violence, a man was shot there in 1917, and there were some arrests here and there but nothing to indicate it was a dank hovel where one was in imminent danger upon entering. With his seemingly legal involvement with the Harvard Inn, and other non-criminal activities such as boxing promoter, Yale was seen by some as a Brooklyn sportsman. His doings even made the social column of a local paper when it was noted that on Saturday night, April 24, 1920, he and Mrs. Yale entertained Mr. and Mrs. John Torrio for dinner on their final night in New York before traveling back to Chicago the following day. Perhaps one of the topics Torrio and Yale discussed was the problem the former was having with his Chicago boss, Big Jim Colosimo. It seems that Torrio wanted to go in for bootlegging but Colosimo was content with his brothels and gambling establishments and didn't want to bother with the boon that was bootlegging. Less than 3 weeks later, on May 11, 1920, Colosimo was gunned down in the vestibule of his nightclub, clearing the way for Torrio to take control of his rackets. It has long been believed that Yale made the trip out west and did his old benefactor a favor. Other theories have Capone, who moved to Chicago circa 1919 as the gunman. The following February 6, 1921, Yale found himself in the crosshairs when he and two other men exited a building in Lower Manhattan and gunmen opened fire on them. One of the men, Michael DeMorsi, was killed and Yale took a bullet to the lung and was arrested later at the hospital. There was much strife in the Italian underworld in 1921 and 1922, and the February 6 shooting may have been part of it. 4 months later, on June 6, a Manhattan gangster named Ernest Melchiorre was lured to Brooklyn under some guise. He was last seen alive at the Harvard Inn. The following day he was found in an empty lot nearly decapitated. Yale was arrested for the murder but released. Another attempt on Yale's life came at around 3 a.m. on July 15. His brother Angelo had picked him up at the Harvard Inn and, with 3 others in the car including Anthony Carfano, headed for home. During the drive, a sedan pulled up alongside them and fired more than 20 shots into the Yale car. 13 of them perforated the auto and the top of the convertible was blown off. Though Angelo was hit in the shoulder and another passenger wounded, Frankie, the intended target, emerged unscathed. It was speculated that the attempt was in retaliation for the murder of Ernesto Melchiorre. More fuel was added to that fire when 8 days later, Ernesto's brother Silvio was gunned down outside of his Lower Manhattan cafe. Another 2 years would pass before Yale was on the spot again. On July 9, 1923, Yale and his family attended a christening and the celebration spilled into the next morning. At about 1 a.m., things were breaking up and Yale and a friend decided to walk home. They had a young man named Frank Forte drive their wives and kids back to Yale's house. Just after the women and children exited the car, Forte began to turn around when a sedan pulled up and 2 men opened fire. Forte was instantly killed with 4 shots. Yale, who was 4 blocks away, heard the shooting and saw the sedan speed away. It is believed the gunman mistook Forte for Yale. Out in Chicago, John Torrio was having his own gangland troubles. Things came to a head with a gangster adversary named Dean O'Banion. The latter double-crossed Torrio on the sale of a brewery. When the latter showed up to take ownership, the feds were waiting for him and he was arrested. A death sentence was passed on the Irish gangster. In November 1924, Mike Merlo, the head of what was called the Unione Siciliana, a powerful Italian political organization with great influence in the Italian underworld, died. Yale and a fellow Brooklyn Confederate named Sam Palacio came to Chicago for the funeral. Just as Yale was an undertaker on the books, Torrio's nemesis Dean O'Banion was a florist and all the mobsters were using him for their floral tributes for Merlo's funeral. On November 10, 1924, 3 men, believed to be Yale and 2 of Torrio's gunmen, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, paid a visit to O'Banion's shop. The Irish gang boss greeted Yale with a handshake. The Brooklyn gangster held tight as Torrio's torpedoes drew guns and fired several shots into their victim. O'Banion dropped to the floor with bullets in his chest and throat. Once down, he got a final one in the head. Yale and Palacio were arrested while attempting to board a train back to New York and held for the murder. Lacking evidence, the police had to release them. The death of O'Banion ignited a gang war in which Torrio was severely wounded in an attempt on his life. Within a year or so, he turned everything over to Al Capone and fled Chicago. Yale and Capone enjoyed a mutually beneficial relationship. Underworld lore dictates that just as Yale ventured to Chicago to remove rivals for his friends, Capone returned the favor by taking out a number of Irish gangsters for Yale on Christmas night 1925. For a deeper dive into this infamous gangland massacre, you can watch my video The White Hand Gang Part 2. Somewhere, Yale's relationship with Capone went south. It's been stated that the trouble began when Capone installed men that Yale didn't like into the top spot of the Unione Siciliana. It is also believed that Yale was hijacking liquor trucks that belonged to Capone before they made it out of Brooklyn. Allegedly, Capone suspected Yale of the hijackings and recruited Yale gangster Rafael D'Amato, who was arrested with Capone in 1925 for the aforementioned Christmas massacre of Irish gangsters, to spy for him. D'Amato confirmed Capone's suspicions but not before Yale learned of his duplicity. A few minutes before midnight on July 7, 1927, D'Amato was seen speaking with two guys on the street. After they concluded their conversation, he turned to walk away. Before he got far, the men ran up behind him and fired several shots into his body. D'Amato dropped to the sidewalk, dead. The gunman then jumped into a sedan and sped away. Another occurrence involving the gang boss took place in 1927. This one involved a different Frankie Yale. Not the murderous gangster but the quote, philanthropic sportsman. Through his generosity as a boxing promoter, he put on a charity bout that raised thousands of dollars for the St. Rosalie Church, which suffered much damage from a fire. Previously, he had also put up the money to build a school for the church. Perhaps Yale was looking to reinvent himself at this time. Not only did he actively use his name to promote the charity boxing match, he also posed for photos for both the match and the groundbreaking for the new school. It appears that he was quite chummy with the sports writer for Brooklyn's Times-Union newspaper, Jimmy Wood, who gushed over him in several articles. The Times-Union introduced the new Frankie Yale with an article that began, "With your permission, we present Frankie Yale." The question naturally follows, who is Frankie Yale? Frankie, Jimmy Wood tells us, is a power in the home-loving community of Bay Ridge and other points from here to Chicago and back again. What kind of power he didn't disclose. Although it was mentioned that to promote the charity event, Yale was stepping away from his taxicab business and various other interests. Again, the journalist was vague on the other interest. In the final write-up before the charity event, Jimmy Wood referred to the gangster as "my friend Frankie" no less than 4 times. Including, "My friend Frankie can pat himself on the back for getting this bout." He concluded with a final appeal for his readers to attend the affair by saying, to fall back on an old reliable line, "It's for a great cause. And a great guy, my friend Frankie Yale." The following month, the Times-Union mentioned that Yale attended a special boxing match that was exhibited especially for Charles Lindbergh, and there are numerous other instances of Yale appearing in the Times-Union sports section. One wonders if Yale's underworld associates, namely Mafia chieftain Joe the Boss Masseria, bristled at the fact that he was receiving such media attention. Something that is a big no-no in gangland. None of this mattered to Yale on that July 1st afternoon when bullets shattered his rear window. Though Lady Luck had been with him in the past, she wasn't riding with him that day. The assassins gained on him and, pulling up alongside him, poured both shotgun and machine gun fire into his car, nearly taking off the back of his head. Losing control of his Lincoln, Yale jumped the curb, plowed through some hedges and crashed into a residential porch. Onlookers were greeted with a grisly sight. The rear of the gang leader's head had been turned to pulp and one ear hung by a thread. His violent death and the gaudy funeral that followed eclipsed anything that Yale did in life. His murder was the first time a Thompson machine gun had been used in New York City. That and the other guns were wielded by a contingency of Capone killers known as his American Boys. Consisting of Fred Getz, a.k.a. Shotgun George Ziegler, Fred Killer Burke and Gus Winkler. The car was driven by Capone mobster Louis Little New York Campagna. For more on Capone's American Boys, please watch my video, Fred Getz, the college-educated gunman who killed for Al Capone. Regarding his funeral, Yale was buried out of St. Rosalia, the church he had done so much for. It was estimated that between 10 and 15,000 people gathered for the event that cost in the neighborhood of $52,000. 10,000 or so just for the casket. Streets were lined with citizens who watched the parade of over 100 cars in the funeral cortege, including 38 needed just to transfer the flowers. Supposedly, when Dean O'Banion was buried back in 1924 with much pomp, Yale told his boys that when his time came, he wanted to go out just as big. Adding to the already dramatic affair was that 2 Mrs. Yales showed up. Frankie's divorce from his first wife was just going into effect and his new bride, along with her baby, showed up to mourn as the official Mrs. Yale. The first Mrs. Yale wasn't ready to relinquish the title just yet. We know who pulled the triggers on Frankie Yale, the whys can be guessed at. Was Yale ripping off Capone's alcohol trucks? The story goes that Rafael D'Amato spied and died as a result. But he was killed a full year before Yale. Would Capone have really waited an entire year to take care of that problem? One author suggests that Yale was making nice with mafia boss Salvatore Maranzano and Joe the boss didn't like it. Perhaps Masuria wanted Yale dead and Capone simply supplied the gunman. Perhaps his entire underworld network didn't like the fact that he was appearing in the press as a great benefactor. Was he heading for the straight and narrow with his legitimate enterprises and the likes of Masuria, Carfano and Capone weren't happy? We will never know for certain why Frankie Yale, the Beau Brummel of Brooklyn, had to die. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing. If you would like to learn more about Prohibition-era gangsters bumped off in New York City, you can read about them in my books. Links are in the description. There's also a PayPal link there if you would like to support the channel.